University of London. She is the author of two books, Pakistan's Arms, Procurement and Military Build-Up, 1999 to 99, In Search of a Policy, and also Inside Pakistan Military Economy, published in 2007. She was the inaugural Pakistan Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., a fourth fellow at the Bonn International Center for Scholars, the Center for Conversation, and a research fellow at the Cooperative Monitoring Center, SASNET National Laboratories in the United States. She was also the correspondent for the prestigious Jane's Defense Weekly in Pakistan and has contributed to various academic journals. She is a regular column writer in Pakistan's English daily paper Express Tribune. Dr. Siddiqa has taught at the School of Advanced International Studies, Johns Hopkins University in the United States, and University of Pennsylvania. Her area of expertise includes civil-military relations in South Asia, military decision-making, and socio-politics of militancy in Pakistan. Today, she will talk about Pakistan's middle class and modernity between the military and militancy. It's not about the middle class today, which says something about
that's the new thing in the region. Can I get my slides?
I'm sorry.
Sorry, I needed to get my PowerPoint.
Oh, it's not here. Lars, you have to help me here.
Describes me as I'm a gypsy scholar living in Pakistan. I thought I'm going to talk about Pakistan's middle class and modernity, and the term I use, the subtext is between military and militancy. Now, here, military and militancy are two symbolic terms. When I say military, doesn't mean military is an organization, but it's representative of all forms of authority and authoritarianism. And when I say militancy, I'm not looking at violence, violent militancy, but that means a lot of trends, starting from latent radicalism, from pre-radicalism to latent radicalism to active radicalism and active violence. I've never been good with numbers. I was very poor at mathematics in school. So I'm not going to look at very deeply into, the dynamics of although I do discuss the numbers, but I'm not going to get into the details of how middle class has progressed. What I thought I'd focus on was the attitudes and aptitudes of the middle class, its politics, which is extremely essential to understand. Of course, I'm not suggesting for a minute that there are not changes, there are not negotiations at various levels. I mean, there are negotiations happening all the time. You have the dispossessed class, tribes which surface, which become part of the middle class, become empowered, become much more powerful politically. However, there is a macro politics, which is what I'm going to talk about. See, recently there has been a spate of new literature in Pakistan, which talks about the middle class as if it is, it symbolizes this perfection, a perfect change, a much desired change, and it talks about the middle class in terms of a new Pakistan. So there's almost an imagination of abandoning the old Pakistan, which was dominated by the traditional power elite. And here you have a lot of discussion about the growing middle class, and this is very empowering because it has a component of increased urbanization. So we're talking about changing attitudes, a vibrant entrepreneurial class. We're talking about economic development and industrial progress. We're increasingly talking about a free and assertive media. a ferociously independent judiciary, which seems to have challenged the military dictator, who continues to do that. In fact, as I speak, we have the former dictator back in Pakistan trying to struggle, has been imprisoned, is in house arrest and all of that. He has to kind of face the same judiciary which he had tried to dominate and put behind bars. So the new discourse, or the new narrative is that we are looking at a new Pakistan where things cannot be done as they used to be done in the past. That the military, in fact, may be a dominant player, but it's something of the past. It needs to negotiate, much more. The negotiation is much more tougher than it used to be. And needless to say, people also talk about a larger segment of youth. Pakistan is at a point where we're talking about 45. It's a population of 180 million plus, and we're looking at, in the next 20 years, we're looking at a population of 45 million youth, 18 from age 18 to 25. So, and this is a younger group of people, and some of you who may be tuned with Pakistani politics these days, the new thing, the more exciting thing today is this new party which belongs to a former cricketer, Imran Khan. Everybody is gaga over him. I mean, there is this excitement. It is believed that the bulk of the youth will vote for him. In fact, the new middle class seem to be attracted to him. Now, it's a different. Pakistan is going to go for general elections on 11th May, which is next month, and we will see if that does happen. I have my doubts about it, but this is an impression which is being created. And the ultimate, message behind all of this is that there is a shift, there is a move towards replacing the traditional landed feudal power elite. So if you replace them, since these are the extortionist forces, you will then have come up with a different Pakistan which will be much more democratic, much more dynamic, much more modern. So with middle class, you have this mantra of modernity. Now what I want to do is actually deconstruct, theoretically and empirically, both the concepts of modernity and middle class. But starting with conceptualizing middle class in Pakistan, this issue of numbers. Now there are three figures that one comes across when talking about middle class in Pakistan. There is one number which is very conservative. It says that there are 20 million people who belong to this class. Then there is another figure which is again back of the envelope calculation by the economist Ayesha Siddiqa, who says it's 35 million. However, there is an economist who has systematically worked using various models of, based on purchasing power parity, on PPP, using different models, and arrived at this concept of an extended middle class, which she says her name is Durraiz Nayab, and you could probably find her paper on the internet if you Google it. Now, she talks about 61 million people in this class, which is roughly 35% of total population. So there is definitely an increase in the middle class. I mean, as opposed to in the past, Pakistan, one of the reasons that one had always heard about why there was lesser progress, lesser social progress in Pakistan, or even economic progress, was because it had a smaller middle class. And now we're looking at an extended middle class, which is upper middle class, and lower middle class, as 61 million or 35% of the population. Now this trend goes hand in hand with another trend, which is urbanization. In fact, within South Asia, Pakistan has one of the highest rate of urbanization. There is you have smaller towns emerging. In fact, to give you an example of the largest province, Pakistan, Punjab, which kind of controls most of politics of the country. Punjab is, for example, today 5 large cities, 15 intermediate-sized cities, 74 small cities, and 114 towns. Dr. Arif Hassan, who is one of prominent urban planners in Pakistan. Now, his argument is that there is a lot of internal migration in the country, which results in urbanization. And out of that, 8% are migrants. But out of that, 63.7% of these people are migrants from rural areas to urban areas. The rural is in fact merging with the cities or with the urban. You have smaller towns, smaller cities emerging, which are on the edges of the urban and the rural. Now, socially, it means a lot of things. It also means that the conservatism of one continues to feed into, the modernity of the urban centers. But that is a discussion we can have later. Who belongs to this middle class? What are the different groups which form this middle class? The bulk of it, in fact, is the military and civil bureaucracy. The military is roughly about 650,000 strong, and at a point, soon after independence, you had, the ruling elite being part of the military. Now it is almost entirely middle class, lower middle class and middle class. A lot of officer cadre, for example, is coming. That comes from urban centers. So there is urbanization, and there is also increasing number of middle class there. Civil bureaucracy, which is fairly large, that again comes from the middle class. Then you have trader merchants. And trader merchants is a category that you find in rural areas, that you find in urban centers as well. 1980s and 2000s, 2 critical periods when there was a lot of injection of resources, courtesy the United States and the West. Now that in itself has resulted in the growth of the middle class. So what you now have is media, you have the legal community, you have the NGOs, and interestingly, one other group, which I've also counted as part of the middle class, is the leadership of religious right organizations, including militant groups. In fact, what is very interesting about, for example, this whole debate about jihadism in Pakistan versus Afghanistan is that while the Afghan warriors belong to the lower class and perhaps lower middle class, the Pakistani militants they represent them. They definitely represent the middle class. So, they're much more dynamic, much greater connectivity. Now, let me quickly jump to how do you conceptualize modernity before I kind of begin to explain what is happening in Pakistan in terms of ideology. Let me conceptualize modernity. Now, traditionally, modernity is seen in material terms as a set of ideas, which predominantly represents Western liberalism. However, the question which I would like to ask, and what I would argue, as Charles Taylor has done, that is modernity rational, necessarily rational, and culture neutral? You can have technology, but does it necessarily mean that it's culture neutral? Does it not respond to the cultural environment? Or if you look at the work by Harold Gold, you see there is this modernity tradition model in which he talks about the two shaking hands. Now, when I talk about tradition, it's not just it's kind of three set of variables, which is social structures, behavioral models, and ideologies. And ideologies do play a role in this is how relationships, they're fundamental to how relationships, social relationships are negotiated. So what we see is the desire to be modern, to preserve tradition, is not necessarily in conflict. And as Eisenstadt proposes, modernity and westernization, again, are not identical. And my conclusion here is that tradition in the form of ideology can often negotiate relationship in a way that takes it away from Western liberalism. The new modern, therefore, may not necessarily define modernity in terms of Western liberalism, but more in political terms, certainly in terms of anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism. And for a lot of scholars, including, for example, a gentleman who belonged to the left, still does, Tariq Ali, the Taliban and the Jihadi, in fact, is an anti-imperialism drive. And that's how a lot tend to define it. The other thing, which is now, how do you fit this modern with the middle class? Surinder had very aptly described the middle class, and I don't want to get into the detail, but conceptually, middle class is equated with the modern. Well, Karl Marx defines it on the basis of relationship with mode of production, Max Weber on the basis of wealth, power, and prestige. And it's the later definition which, for me, is important. Now, when I look at Pakistan, when I look at these, the conceptual framework, and I try to apply it in Pakistan, there are these roughly five conclusions that I draw. Let me present it to you first before I get into those details. Firstly, that there are two, in terms of attitude, there are two broad trends that you see amongst the middle class. One is what I call neoliberal nationalism. It's authoritarian and uses a top-down model of economic and social political development. Then you have right-wing radical nationalism, and which looks at anti-imperialism and geopolitical modernity. It thinks in that framework. And the bulk of the middle class, it follows, either of these two trends. And therefore, my, I think, most important argument is that what Pakistan has become today is what I would call a hybrid theocracy. And by hybrid theocracy, what I mean is that you have very small pockets where, for example, Sharia is implemented in reality. For example, a territory like Swat, nowhere else. But you have larger spaces in which liberalism does not enter anymore. So, for example, you do not necessarily have to have a larger law to challenge or negotiate with Sharia. For example, if you have a law, if you're dealing with an issue of blasphemy, for instance, you don't actually have to have implementation of Sharia. It is something which no one would challenge. And I'm talking about the educated middle class as well. This is something where the smaller pockets, you have smaller pockets of liberalism, which are kind of withering away, which are kind of getting smaller and smaller. And this particular segment has no capacity to come and operate in the larger space where Sharia is informally implemented as part of a custom. So when you're dealing with women's issues, when you're dealing with issues like blasphemy, when you're dealing with issues like minority, I found it very interesting recently. When I went to Sindh, which is considered a land of Sufis, you have a lot of Hindu minority also living there. It was very interesting. It was not very recently. There have been a couple of cases in which there was accusation of girls being converted, Hindu girls being converted to Islam forcibly. And here is an instance of, you have an increase of free will marriages as well. So this is probably, these cases also belong to that category. It's not that they are being forcibly taken in Muslim families, but conversion is totally different issue. I mean, you do not get a space, you do not get that choice, whether to say that I want to marry this man, but I do not want to convert. And the problem increases, especially when the girls come from higher caste Hindu families. And what is becoming problematic, where the middle class also joins in primarily, is that it does not challenge the modality at all. And when it comes to, for example, conversion of minority groups, they kind of wear it around their neck like a trophy. So you have low caste women who either get converted or don't get converted, but continue to live. But when it comes to the higher caste, then you have greater publicity, greater coming together of different groups, which includes people from the middle class. What is also very obvious is that this middle class, this new middle class, this is evolving middle class, also tends to have an authoritarian attitude. 2007, 2008, when the lawyers' movement happened, there was, it was fairly popular, and they kind of rescued the judiciary from the grips of the military dictator, Pervez Musharraf. One had expected that we were looking at strengthening of the rule of law. What happened was otherwise. For instance, the legal community used that activity, that action, to actually become part of becoming a stakeholder to power itself. So then you would have instances and cases after cases where it was the lawyers, the legal community, which was breaking the law. For example, a couple of years ago, there was a lawyer who beat his 12-year-old house help to death. And all lawyers across the board were forbidden to contest her case. And the very freakish thing is that that informal ban was upheld. There was no human rights activist or lawyer who stood up for that case. So you begin to kind of create your own legal framework, your informal legal framework, or your behavioral framework, which then you don't kind of allow to be negotiated. The other thing is that religionism is also extending and expanding itself. And partly because the middle class today finds religion or religionism extremely empowering. And let me quickly go into the definition of it. I mean, when I talk about religion and religionism, I'm borrowing from the Israeli sociologist Yuri Ram, who has discussed the manner in which religion or religionism interacts with nationalism or shapes it. He has used 4 heuristic models that explain the linkage between nationalism, secularism, and religionism. It is about the manner in which political legitimacy is gained through different blends of politics and religion. And the 4 models that he talks about are strong nationalism, weak religionism, strong nationalism, strong religionism, third is weak nationalism, weak religionism, and the 4th is weak nationalism, strong religionism. And my conclusion is that Pakistan belongs to the 4th model, which is weak nationalism and strong religionism. That has happened over years. If I were to, for example, quickly take you through this. What happens here, how do you get to, there is radical extremism. Radicalism, extremism is a process in which you have a pre-radicalism phase, a latent radicalism phase, and an active radicalism phase. And what has happened in Pakistan's case is that it has slowly moved from weak nationalism, weak nationalism and weak religionism. To correct it, in the 1970s to weak nationalism, moderate religionism in the 1980s, but finally graduated to weak nationalism and strong religionism. So this isn't something which is, it's how relationships are negotiated, how structures shake hands with each other. This is what makes this concept very important. Now, there have been 4 waves of, as I said, of religionism, which started off from 1947. Pakistan was always made in the name of Islam, but 1950s and 60s we see a lot of politics in which a minority group, Ahmadiyya, was targeted. There were a lot of negotiations between the religious right, which initially did not want to become part of Pakistan, but who eventually dominated the politics. And a lot of leaders, in the name of pragmatism, realpolitik, very happily negotiated. So in 1977, we see that come to fruition in the form of a law banning the Ahmadis by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. Then you have, of course, the 1980s, which is the Zia period, but it's also a period when the jihadis or the terrorists of today are the mujahideen, when it's good to fight the war in Afghanistan, and that's a decade where a lot of ideological transformation of the state and society happens. And this is critical. This change of attitude or the way attitudes develop is critical. It stays on. It becomes part of your personality, of your imagination. Then a third wave is during the 1990s, when religion spread as a social movement. In fact, it entered into the middle class space. You had movements like Al-Huda, which completely addressed the middle class, in fact, upper middle class women. So it actually entered your home, that kind of a informal space. For example, summer holidays, what do you do with your young girls? You send them to Al-Huda. But they wouldn't just go to Al-Huda. When they would return, they'd bring that ideology with them. So suddenly, mothers would be confronted with a situation when actually young girls were judging them. So what do you do? How do you handle it? And that ideological transformation is so strong that, in fact, it was the mothers who began to conform. And mothers weren't just then conforming, it was spreading out, it went around viral in almost the entire family. 1990s again was also a period when Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is basically a British movement, started there, also started to spread. Very recently, this is like a couple of months ago, Oxford University, Pakistan Students' Union held a conference in Oxford on Pakistan. And it's so interesting that the entire agenda of the conference was dominated by Hizb ut-Tahrir, which sat there and talked about Pakistan as the next caliphate. And this is what makes Hizb ut-Tahrir effective, its ability to kind of very gently enter the middle class, attract them. And the possibilities are there, phenomenal, especially in a state which has serious governance issues. And so for a lot of people, a recipe to bad governance is a system which in their minds has never been used before, which is Sharia, as a recipe for good governance. Not to mention the fact that since the 1980s, the state has very consistently supported religion, even in its extreme forms. There has been a support of jihadism as assets. Now, one more thing which I would like to explain is that, so one of my conclusions is that there is this middle class which is largely latent radical. And when I talk about radicalism, it's in the realm of the essential thought process that can then translate at some point into violent extremism, but not necessarily. So when I say latent radical, I'm not suggesting for a minute that here are these bunch of people who are about to turn Taliban. I'm not suggesting that for a minute. But it is essentially about how they visualize the other. And if you are, and so here I'm talking about the political use of religion becoming a grand norm. And depending on how political and social systems supports the anchoring of a particular ideology, grand norm, the society moves from one stage, which is pre-radicalism, to the next, which is latent radicalism. And if it's needed, it then can move to a third stage as well. So this is what I'm essentially talking about. The final, what you see at the top, violent extremism, may be a result of this, and that is when it's required. It doesn't happen automatically. It has to be translated. A couple of final points that I want to make is that the literature that I was referring to, which looks at middle class and argues about its modernity, as if we're about to reach a stage of, and when it looks at modernity, it talks about modernity in terms of the traditional definition of Western liberalism. Now, essentially, I think there are four problems with it, with that kind of formulation. One is that it does not address the issue of successive, it does not understand the elite formation process. It doesn't definitely look at elite formation as an ongoing process. It looks at Pakistan and says, and its history, and says, all right, historically there is this landed feudal elite which has been there forever. However, the reality is that that landed feudal elite has become extinct, almost extinct. So barring one province and a half, which is Sindh and Balochistan. Sindh is much more populated, and that's why it's not meant as an insult to Balochistan or Balochis, but when I say half, it means in terms of population and numbers. It's very scattered, very small people. You have a tribal system there. In Sindh, you have feudalism, which has expanded in the last 15 years. I talked about recently traveling to Sindh, and I remember when I drove back from across the Sindh border into Punjab, it was almost like driving from Mexico into the United States. So that's that stark difference in terms of development, and that is also one of the catchment areas. As far as radical ideology is concerned. But in other parts of the country, it has been through at least 4 cycles of elite formation, in which middle class has risen to become powerful, and in terms of its attitude, become as feudal as the landed feudal. The military itself, the bureaucracy itself, in terms of its attitude, is very feudal in its instinct. It may not come from the landed feudal class, but in terms of its attitude, it is that. And therefore, my argument is that unless state structures change, unless that transformation happens, attitudes do remain, for lack of a better word, static. The other thing is that the other misconception is that middle class is seen, according to that literature, seen as necessarily politically progressive, which it is not. So what, in fact, Surinder was also talking about, that here is this rising middle class, urbanized, which wants to, when it looks at progress and development and the state, it imagines it in terms of a country like Singapore. And that is perhaps not a surprise, because in states where governance is very poor, there is a certain way that people react. And for the middle class in Pakistan, their reaction is that they think essentially in terms of Singapore. They don't bother about authoritarianism. It's surprisingly that the youth is becoming increasingly apolitical. And this is a trend which, by the way, you find in most of South Asia. There is a depoliticization, a delegitimization of politics in many ways, created due to poor governance, and also strengthening of the right. To give you an example of how it operates, in 2010, I did a study of mapping the social political attitudes of youth in elite universities in 3 major cities of Pakistan, which is Lahore, Islamabad, and Karachi. And this is, what I came up with. For example, when asked, how important is religion for you? 57% said, yes, it's important, very important. 23% said, important. Very recently, the British Council has done a survey with a larger sample size. And when asked, what do you think is the best political system for Pakistan, the answer was 38% said Islamic Sharia, 32% said military rule, 29% said democracy, and only 1%, interestingly, talked about communism. Again, the survey which I did, one of the questions asked was, is Muslim Ummah a concrete reality or an abstract idea? How did you, imagine it? And I found it very interesting that 42% of the respondents said concrete reality. And mind you, I'm talking about kids who go to art schools, who go to, very liberal universities, private universities. One final question asked, should Pakistan become a secular state? And 56% said no. And what we're looking here is opinion, at least a perspective on, and this is upper middle class, largely. These are private universities. I mean, these are the kids who would otherwise go to, Yale and Harvard and wherever. So in conclusion, I would like to make a couple of points, which is that my reason behind doing this survey, studying these attitudes was, I wanted to evaluate if poverty alone is the main driver behind militancy or extremism. And you found that those attitudes or world opinions could be similar world opinions as you would get from a madrasa-going kid. You would find the same opinion in these elite university-going kids. There was not just lack of education or poverty, it was something else driving it. And the other point is that latent radicalism is actually, I would say, a result of modernity. It's an expression of modernity. You have a new middle class which is which feels empowered. It talks in terms of anti-colonialism, and it talks in terms of anti-imperialism. It looks at its leadership and sees it too linked with imperialist forces. And it resists. And therefore, this is their expression of modernity. What is creating greater space for them is the fact that traditional religion, or the way religion has been imagined in that part of the world, is pre-modern. In fact, what is interesting is that as the society becomes latent, what I call latent radical, part of the reason is that this is actually in many, many, many years or centuries, this is the first time that religion is coming to Pakistan. Let me explain how. It's not that we are not Muslims, but we've had different traditions. I mean, this is a land where you've had Sufism, Sufi culture. Now, if you deconstruct Sufi culture, now that Sufi culture is actually very connected with the indigenous culture. You know, the plural Hindu, Sikh, or whatever local traditions that there were. And in that, what you have is that people may claim to be Muslims, but do they understand religion the same way as they're expected to do by the orthodox religious schools? For example, there are many people, recently when candidates for elections to National Assembly were presenting their papers, it was interesting. A lot of returning officers were asking them to recite the second kalma or the third kalma, which you would suppose that a Muslim would know. Majority of them didn't know it. Wouldn't be surprised. I mean, this is not something which people do on a daily basis, but our knowledge of, what I'm arguing is that the knowledge of Islam, the new Islam, is being shaped up gradually. If you go to Fatah, the tribal areas, one of the things which is equated with Islam in particular, besides Judaism, is circumcision of the male. Now, if you go to the tribal areas, areas after areas, tribes after tribes which do not do circumcision. Similarly, South Punjab is again an area where the knowledge of religion is the new religion or the modern Islam is very limited. So people would go to the shrines, people would follow certain traditions, which may not necessarily have got anything to do with religion. So religion is actually coming and visiting that place. And one final point, why this is also expanding, is because due to, we live in a state where, or in a country where political power is very hard to renegotiate. And therefore, militancy and extremism, which is the extreme form of this latent radicalism, cycle, militancy is seen as that source of power which can be used to renegotiate with the state. So, what the militants are offering at the moment, for example, is two things: legitimacy of their power on the basis of religion, and two, ability to have a semi-monopoly over violence. So if you can combine that, you become a force that can then negotiate with the state. And therefore, that power is increasing. Thank you so much for your patience. We can have the rest of the discussion during
So the floor is open for questions and comments. Please.
Okay, this is not quite about the middle class. I just want some comments and clarifications. And first, I have to say that was really, really interesting, fascinating. Where do I start? I wonder, first of all, about this idea of who is a Muslim and who is not, and religion coming to Pakistan. What you're describing happening in Pakistan is happening to some extent in Bangladesh, not as much perhaps, but this struggle between the Sufis and the more orthodox Wahhabis is taking a new shape right now, partly because of global events, global Islam plus the war on terror, partly because of what's happening on the ground inside Bangladesh. But I think it seems to me, at least my reading of inside Bangladesh of the Sufis, is that they would very much consider themselves to be Sufis, of Muslims, rather than something separate. And that what's happening is a homogenization and orthodoxization of because of the rising public visibility of Islam, rising public piety. Instead of multiple ways of being Muslim, there's increasingly one way of being Muslim that's legitimate. So there's a war there, so it's just a really small point, but I think it's a very important point about who can claim to be a Muslim and who is deciding who can be a Muslim. And the state in Pakistan, it would seem to be particularly implicated in that, starting with the Ahmadis and then, various other things. So that's something to think about. But that's just an aside. I'm very interested in hearing about a small point that I think you left out, which is where is there a left movement? And to my knowledge, there are at least some very strong farmers' movements, for instance, against, land that the army wants, for instance, or some worker strikes, textile worker strikes. This is not the middle class, but I wonder how it plays into your analysis, and I wonder if you could talk about that. I had a whole bunch of other things, but this idea that the middle class, the secular middle class, the smaller pockets of liberalism, that has no capacity to operate in a space that's being taken over, I guess by the Sharia, as you say, and then you say blasphemy, women, minorities, all of these things. I wonder if you can talk about that. Then you went on to talk about these accusations of conversion of Hindu women into Muslims, and there's a certain celebration, of course, when it's an upper class woman who's answered. But it seems, these are very similar to the kinds of cases that I see in Bangladesh, and they are almost inevitably about marriage, right? And they're about cross-religious marriage.
Yeah.
Marriages of free will, as you call them, right? So the secular middle class being surrounded and not having a space for talking. I mean, so anyway, they're not very articulate, but
no, you're very articulate. You know, what I was arguing, let me start with your third point. Yes, that space is being appropriated by the Islamists. But what it does do then is that it generates a certain level of sympathy within a larger public. And because religion is so political, you have to appreciate that. Because it is so political, then it does not just remain in the realm of simply the Islamist. It extends. So, for example, this young Hindu girl, barely in her teens, who got converted. Now, her husband is also from the lower middle class. They're from, they are middle class people. Now, the way it has been celebrated makes him think that this is something he can be proud of. So, it does affect the attitude. Your second question about, is there a left movement? Very weak. As I joke about it, there's nothing left of the left definitely in Pakistan. Yes, there are movements. There are movements, for example, you're referring to the Okara movement, right? Now, these were essentially, a lot of these people were Christians. They were not even Muslims, but where they had an element of both. But the problem there is that I went and interacted with them, and you realize that their attitude, they may protest the military takeover of what they consider is their right, yet in terms of their social attitudes, they are also drifting towards religion. That is essential. That is something which doesn't get challenged. Which leads me to the comment that you made about who can claim to be a Muslim. You see, this is a space when the problem is with this modern religion, modern form of religion, there is nobody else which is contesting that space. The Sufis, yes, call themselves that, but the point is that the Sufi culture is pre-modern. It does not, for example, when you get education, you want textual evidence, which the Pir is not that comfortable in providing. Doesn't provide that as fast as, for example, Lashkar-e-Taiba or Jamaat-e-Islami or some other group. So, when you technologically, in terms of your material acquisitions, when you become modern, then you want the ideology to kind of match. And that doesn't happen. So my problem, for example, is that the Sufis, the whole range of it, when I'm confronted with, for example, a case of blasphemy, and when I go to the Sufi and ask in search of a counter-narrative or a counter-explanation, he doesn't have any. Because what has happened over years is that the Sufi tradition has become, out of laziness, has become redundant. It has become institutionalized. So, a couple of centuries ago, when you had Pirs and Sufis who were actually engaging with the discourse, the modern Pir is not. So he's going to give me almost the same answer as a mullah. And the mullah, in fact, would do it much better, would have textual evidence, would pick up the book, the holy book, and say, all right, verse so-and-so, verse so-and-so. This one, on the other hand, wouldn't have that. So, who can claim to be a Muslim is something which then gets dominated. And that, my issue is that is the problem, it's also a problem of modernity. this greater religionism is an outgrowth of that, because it is at a level very empowering. And I'll give you an example. What does a Sufi or a Pir, if you go to, tell you? All right, if you want to reach God, if you want to be, to be in conversation with God, etc., etc., you have to go through the Pir. You have to first establish a communication with the Pir for him to then assist you to go to that next stage. Now, what the militant or the religious right is offering is a phenomenal package. For example, if you become a martyr, just an example, I mean, not everybody does that, but if you become a martyr, very attractive for the male company, you get 72 virgins, a queen virgin on top, you get a crown of jewels, and you get to have 70 individuals pardoned, which apparently is a facility not even provided to a prophet. So the package deal is very modern, it's very attractive. It's much more marketable than what a Sufi can offer. So, the dynamics of, what is a Muslim then begins to change.
We have a very limited time, but I have two more questions here. Stig and Pamela, I will ask you to please be very short, and we'll take the two questions and then a short answer. Please, Stig.
The case with the lawyer who didn't give help to the servant girl, wasn't he a very prominent lawyer? Please let me remind me of his name. Now, since we are a South Asian group today, how far can you go in making a theory which would cover several South Asian countries in this respect? I mean, I would say for a start that what Dina Siddiqa, Siddiqui and Siddiqa, okay. But Dina Siddiqui said this morning that Shalish and Panchayats are different. I would say that's the wrong starting point. Shalish, Panchayat, Shura, Jirga are all same, and they have some of the same consequences. So that would be one starting point, I would say. Then, on top of tradition, religion may sort of weaponize these different traditions in a different regional, in different manners. And also, could you draw in the Maldives? That's the only place in the subcontinent where you have a military takeover, financed this time to a large extent not only by Saudis, but by the hotel owners, the very people who run the modern business, the middle-class entrepreneurs, financing the reintroduction of Sharia, the introduction of Sharia.
Please, can we have Pamela's question also before you answer, please?
You mentioned that you were in Oslo last December. I was wondering if at that time or any other time you were able to get hold of a copy of a book by a Norwegian Pakistani man named David Hopkins.
Yes.
Yes, because I just wanted to say, with reference to this discussion, I'm curious as to how you respond to his work. He carried out, you correct me if I'm wrong, survey questionnaires, but also long discussions, approximately 460 middle class and working class men, and discovered that while they had a very radical rhetoric in the practice of their lives, they were very moderate. What they said was one thing, what they did was something else. And I was wondering how you respond to his method and his results.
Right. Very familiar with David Hansen's work. Try to go back to the theoretical model that I'm suggesting here. When I say latent radicalism, there is an evolutionary process which is then pushed by a number of factors. So when you are in the stage of latent radicalism, you think in terms of the other judge the other on the basis of your religious ideology or your perceived religious ideology and perceived faith. For example, a Shia then becomes a non-Muslim. An Ahmadi then becomes a non-Muslim and therefore the other. So in every state, be it India or be it Pakistan, be it Sri Lanka, there is always the other. And latent radicalism is about that systematic cycle which converts, which creates that other and then later on evolves into other forms. Now, it is quite unimaginable that those 460 people who were interviewed by David thought radically, didn't act radically. Because A, number of possibilities. A, they were not approached by somebody. There wasn't a need to tap into that resource. And when I talk about increasing latent radicalism, I'm not suggesting for a minute as if everybody round the corner is up in arms. But what you do is create that mental framework which, if someone, some important, significant stakeholder wants to tap into that resource, they possibly can. So you have these 460 people who would, otherwise be moderate. But say, if they were, for a number of reasons, if they were approached by any militant organization, given money, given some inducement, they might then go to the next and the next stage. That's what I'm trying to say. So, your question about the shura, the jirga, etc., being the same. Now, there is one thing which is tradition. Now, we're talking about spaces, and yes, if you talk about Balochistan, if you talk about the frontier province, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, or the tribal areas which had tradition of jirgas, and jirgas were considered conservative. Now, I'm talking about urban centers as well, which had no tradition of those jirgas, which actually had tradition of civilization. And what probably, unfortunately, I could not also present during my talk is also that because of the state softening and at times failing or appearing to do so at places, you have these forces strengthening. For example, in many places, in Punjab itself, which is the hub of civilization there, you have extremist forces actually negotiating on behalf of people. They're holding jirgas themselves. And this is where the state has softened and crumbled. And so there's technically a difference between that traditional jirga and what is developing. And one final thing, Maldives. Very similar to what I also see happening in Pakistan. In fact, what is happening, what I couldn't manage, and I'm grateful that you asked this question, is that because of the weakness of the state, you have these additional forces which have acquired the power to negotiate. I mean, very quickly, what was feudalism? What was the feudal about? The feudal used to negotiate between the colonial state and the citizen, passing on the patronage from the colonial state downwards. Now, here in these forms, here are militants who are doing the same. They are what I call the neo-feudals. And so there are instances, many instances, where real estate, which is the one new big business which has also led to the emergence of the middle class. People go hire the services of these militants, pay them to actually sort out land disputes, do land grabbing, and these are connected with land mafias, deeply connected with land mafias. So what you say about Maldives, I'm not surprised at all that the power mafias there are using, because religion is something prominent. So depending on the nature of the state, I think that can be manipulated and used by mafias anywhere you go.
Thank you so much.